The mechanic laughed when he saw it. Not a polite laugh. A full, dismissive one. The kind that tells you everything you need to know about how a man values your time. The tractor sat at the edge of Dale Whitmore's gravel lot, half hidden under a tarpaulin that had gone green with mold. It was February. The sky over Harlan County was the color of a spent shell casing. And Dale, 53 years old, stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the mechanic walk around the machine, shaking his head. Parts don't even exist for this thing anymore, the mechanic said. You'd spend more fixing it than it's worth. Honestly, Dale, it's scrap. Dale didn't argue. He nodded slowly. And when the man drove away, Dale walked back to that tractor and stood beside it for a long moment. Then he went inside and got a flashlight. Dale Whitmore had been born on the same piece of ground he still farmed. 41 acres outside of Bledsoe, Kentucky, a narrow valley property wedged between two ridge lines, with a creek that ran cold even in July and a south-facing slope his grandfather had first broke with a mule in 1931. The farm had never been large by any measure. His father had worked alongside a job at the feed co-op in town. Dale had worked alongside a job at the county road department for 22 years, until a back injury in 2009 took him off that crew and put him full-time on the land. He raised hay on the lower fields, kept a small beef herd, 12 Angus cows that his wife Margaret helped him tend before she passed in 2017, and sold produce from the kitchen garden at the Bledsoe Farmers Market every other Saturday. He was not a wealthy man. He had never needed to be. The 1984 Kubota M4500 had come with the farm when his father bought the property in 1978. Not a new machine even then. His father had purchased it secondhand from a neighbor who was moving to Ohio. Over the decades, it had pulled bush hogs, run the PTO for a hay baler, dragged logs from the backwoodlet, and carried Dale through more hours of field work than he could count. The hour meter had rolled over twice. Whatever it showed now meant nothing. But the engine had started knocking badly the previous spring. It began losing power on the hills. By August, it wouldn't build oil pressure. Dale had nursed it through fall cutting season by adding a quart of oil before every use and keeping his speed down. Then one morning in November, it simply stopped and would not restart. He'd called 3 mechanics. 2 didn't want to work on anything that old. The third was the one who laughed. Dale wasn't offended. He understood what the man saw. A 40-year-old diesel tractor with no compression, unknown history, and body panels that had gone to rust along every seam. From the outside, it looked like a machine that had given everything it had and had nothing left. But Dale had grown up alongside this tractor. He knew something about it that the mechanic didn't, or at least he suspected he did. And suspicion, with Dale Whitmore, had a way of turning into very quiet, very patient work. When Dale contacted the county extension office that March, he wasn't looking for permission. He was looking for information, specifically whether anyone in the regional agricultural network knew of a rebuilder who still worked on late-model Kubota 4-cylinder diesels. The extension agent he spoke to, a man named Phil Akers, who had been in the role for about 11 years and clearly preferred crop questions to equipment questions, suggested Dale look into a replacement. There were financing programs available, he said. The state had a cost-share program for equipment upgrades on small farms under 50 acres. Dale qualified. You could be in a new Kubota for around $28,000 after the subsidy, Phil told him over the phone. Something with a cab. You'd be a lot more comfortable. Dale thanked him and wrote down the figure in the small spiral-bound notebook he kept on the kitchen table. He wrote it at the top of a fresh page and underlined it twice. He did not call the financing program. What he did instead was go back out to the machine shed, drag the tarpaulin off the tractor completely, and begin a more methodical inspection than he had done before. When he mentioned to his neighbor Bill Racer, a retired soil conservationist who farmed the adjacent property, that he was thinking about trying to restore the machine himself, Bill had been supportive but honest. "Dale, I've seen folks put good money into old iron and end up with nothing to show for it. You sure it's worth the time?" Dale said he wasn't sure of anything yet, but he wanted to know what he was dealing with before he made any decisions. That was late March. What followed was 3 months of work that nobody watched, nobody approved, and nobody, for quite a long time, thought would come to much. Dale's method was not complicated, but it was thorough. He worked on the tractor in the evenings after feeding the cattle, and on weekend mornings when the light was good. He kept the spiral notebook on a folding table near the shed door, and he wrote in it every session. Not long entries, just dates, observations, measurements, and questions. He started by tracing the oil system completely. Every line, every gasket surface, every fitting. He was not a trained mechanic, but he had spent 4 decades maintaining equipment out of necessity, and he had a farmer's eye for what wasn't right. He could see that the main bearing surfaces had wear. He could see that the head gasket had been seeping. The faint mineral stain along the block face told him so, and he measured the moisture content of the air filter housing with a strip of pH paper he'd ordered from a chemistry supply catalog, the kind typically sold to winemakers. The reading was higher than it should have been. He wrote that down. First discovery. Inside the left side panel, behind a corroded bracket he had to cut free with a hacksaw, he found a small tin box bolted to the frame with 2 self-tapping screws. He almost missed it entirely. The box had been painted over at some point, the same green as the tractor body, and had rusted to the same dull patina as everything else. But it was hinged, and when Dale pried it open with a flathead screwdriver, he found a folded stack of papers inside. Yellowed, some of them brittle but intact. They were oil-stained at the edges. They had been there a long time. He carried them to the kitchen table and smoothed them under a lamp. They were service records, handwritten, then later typed. Dates going back to 1971, before his father had even bought the machine. Engine oil changes, filter replacements, valve adjustments, fuel system cleanings. Someone, across multiple decades, had kept meticulous records of every service this tractor had received. Dale sat with those papers for 2 hours that night. He read each entry. He cross-referenced the service intervals against what the Kubota shop manual, a photocopy he'd ordered from a parts dealer in Indiana for $47, said the machine required. He began to understand that this engine had been maintained almost perfectly for the first 22 years of its life. Whoever owned it before his father took it off the lot had been exceptionally careful. He wrote in his notebook, "Engine has known history. Early life, well documented. Failure point, likely specific, not systemic." Second discovery. Dale borrowed a compression tester from Bill Racer's toolbox and tested each cylinder individually, recording the readings in the notebook alongside the date and ambient temperature. Cylinder 1, 287 psi. Cylinder 2, 291 psi. Cylinder 3, 289 psi. Cylinder 4, 41 psi. He tested it again 2 days later. Same result. One cylinder was catastrophically low. The other 3 were within range of factory specification, which for this engine, the Kubota service data listed at 284 to 312 psi. He wrote this down carefully. 3 cylinders were not only functional, they were nearly at factory spec on a 40-year-old engine. That did not happen by accident. That happened because of the service history in the tin box. Third discovery. When Dale pulled the head, a job that took him 2 full days and required borrowing a torque wrench from the auto parts store in town, he found the source of the 4th cylinder's failure clearly visible. The exhaust valve had burned through, not from neglect, but from a coolant leak that had been microscopic and ongoing for years, slowly washing the protective oil film from the valve seat at operating temperature. The leak came from a hairline crack in the lower block near the freeze plug, a crack that was invisible from outside and would not have shown up in any external inspection. The other cylinders were clean. The pistons were in serviceable condition. The bore measurements, which Dale took with a dial bore gauge he rented from an equipment rental place in Harlan for $22 a day, came in at 3.387 inches, just 0.002 inches over the factory spec of 3.385, within tolerance. The block was not worn out. It had one specific, reparable failure. He sat in the machine shed that evening and looked at the engine with the head off. The low sun came through the west door and lit up the cylinder bores. They looked almost new. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt like he'd finally asked the right questions. By late April, Dale had sourced the parts he needed. A resleeved cylinder 4 from a machine shop in Lexington that specialized in antique diesel rebuilds. $340 for the sleeve and valve seat insert, pressed and finished. A new exhaust valve from a Kubota part supplier in Tennessee. A head gasket set. A freeze plug kit. New injector seals, which he replaced as a matter of course since he had the head off anyway. He called Phil Akers again in May, not to ask permission, but because he'd heard through Bill Racer that the county extension office was putting together a small farm equipment survey, and he thought his situation might be useful information. Phil listened politely and then mentioned again that the financing program for replacement equipment was still available and that they were seeing a lot of older operators struggle to maintain machinery from that era. That's understandable, Dale said. Parts availability has gotten harder. He did not mention the tin box or the compression readings. There was nothing to argue about yet. Meanwhile, the hay fields were coming on. The lower 20 acres needed cutting by mid-June or the quality would drop, and he'd lose money on it. He had no other means to run the mower. The Kubota was his only tractor. He looked briefly at renting, but the nearest rental yard with a tractor that fit his PTO setup was 30 miles away and charged $340 per day plus fuel. For the 4 to 5 days of cutting and baling he needed, that was $1,700 at minimum. He wrote that figure in the notebook, too, on the same page as the $28,000 replacement quote, and underlined it. He had until June. That was the pressure. Not dramatic. Not a crisis with sirens. Just a quiet, calendar-driven arithmetic of need. Bill Racer came over one Saturday and helped him lift the head back onto the block. Bill had done some engine work in his time and knew how to run a torque sequence. They worked slowly, talking about the cattle market and the weather, and when it was done, they sat in the shed with 2 cans of L8 and said almost nothing for a while. "You really think this is going to run?" Bill asked. "I think it was running fine in 3 cylinders 2 months ago," Dale said. Bill nodded and didn't push it further. That was the kind of faith that didn't need explaining out loud. He started the engine for the first time on the 14th of June. A Thursday, overcast, with thunderstorms forecast for the weekend that would have ruined any hay he cut if he waited. He bled the fuel system. He checked the oil. He made sure the coolant level was right and that the new freeze plug had fully cured. Then he climbed up, set the throttle to a quarter, and turned the key. The engine turned over 3 times and caught. It ran rough for 30 seconds while the new parts seated and the oil pressure built. The gauge needle climbed, slowly, then steadily, and held at 42 psi at operating temperature. Factory spec for that engine was 35 to 50 psi. He sat in the seat and listened. There was no knock, no rattle from the bearings. Just a 4-cylinder diesel running the way a 4-cylinder diesel is supposed to run. He let it idle for 20 minutes. Then he put it in gear and drove it out of the machine shed and down the lane to the lower field. He cut all 20 acres over 2 days. He baled on the 3rd day, a Saturday, just ahead of the rain. He got 430 bales off that field, a better yield than the previous year, when he'd had a functioning tractor and had still had to rush through the later cuttings. The hay sold at $4.25 per bale at the farmer's market and the 2 local horse operations. He netted $1,827.50. Total cost of the repair, $463, including the parts, the bore gauge rental, the shop manual, and 3 cans of penetrating oil. He sat with those numbers at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening. He had the notebook open. He had the estimate sheet from the mechanic who had laughed. He had Phil Akers' figure of $28,000 written at the top of the page. He did not call anyone. He did not take a photograph. He just sat there in the quiet of the kitchen for a while, and then he closed the notebook. That was all. Bill Racer was the first to hear about it, because Bill had helped with the head and deserved to know the outcome. Dale told him over the fence line one morning in late June, matter-of-factly, the way you'd report the weather. Bill nodded and said he wasn't surprised, and that was more or less the end of the conversation. Word moved the way word moves in small rural communities, slowly, through the side doors of other conversations. Someone at the Bledsoe Farmers Market noticed Dale's "hey" was there early. Someone else mentioned they'd heard the old Kubota was running again. A man named Terrell, who ran a small engine shop in town, called Dale in August to ask what he'd done with the cylinder 4 problem, because he had a similar machine in his yard with a similar symptom. Dale walked him through it on the phone for 45 minutes and didn't charge him anything. Phil Akers stopped by in July. He was doing farm visits for the equipment survey and asked how things had gone with the tractor decision. Dale told him what he'd done. Phil listened, wrote something in his own notebook, and nodded. "I wouldn't have expected that to work," Phil said honestly. "Neither did I," Dale said, "until I saw the compression numbers." There was nothing accusatory in how he said it. Phil was not a bad man. He was a busy man with a wide territory and a set of solutions that worked most of the time. He had looked at the tractor and seen what it appeared to be. Dale had looked at it longer and seen what it actually was. Those are 2 different things, and most of the time nobody talks much about the difference. The tin box with the service records now sits on the shelf above Dale's workbench, next to the notebook from that winter. He started a new notebook for current work. The Kubota M4500 is in the machine shed, serviced, with an oil change and new fuel filters. He has continued to write down every service date, every part replaced, every reading. He expects the records will be useful to someone, someday. He doesn't know who. He doesn't particularly need to. If you're watching this from a small farm where you've got equipment that somebody's already written off, or you've been told the practical thing is to replace what you have and start a payment on something new, I think you'll understand why this story matters. Hit subscribe if you're watching from a county where old iron still turns ground, and where the people who keep it running don't usually end up in any article or any broadcast. These are the stories that don't make the regional news. They don't have a neat ending with a prize or a headline. They just have a man and a machine and a tin box bolted behind a corroded bracket and enough patience to ask the next question. We tell these stories here because someone should. There's a version of this story where Dale Whitmore is a hero, where he proves something important about self-reliance, or about the failure of institutional advice, or about what gets lost when we stop maintaining the things we already have. But that's not how Dale would tell it, and it's probably not how it should be told. What actually happened was quieter than that. A man looked at a machine that everyone else had decided was finished, and he didn't accept that decision. Not out of stubbornness, not out of pride, but because he hadn't actually checked yet. He needed to check. Once he checked, he found out what was true. And what was true turned out to be different from what was assumed. That's the whole story. It fits on about 4 pages of a spiral-bound notebook. The tin box is the part that stays with you, though. Someone, Dale never found out who, had the habit of recording what they did to that machine every time they touched it. They kept that record for more than 20 years.